all the people I engage with on the political left don't seem to realize this. They seem to think the world started in 2010 and everything that's gone wrong since, including, the more painful aspects of austerity, was some kind of political choice that the coalition partners adopted out of some perverse wish to punish people who consume public services. It's complete nonsense.
Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the podcast. And today I'm speaking with former Government Minister Vince Cable and his wife Rachel Smith, who've written a book reflecting on their time in politics from around the financial crash all the way to the 2019 election. Vince was a cabinet minister in the coalition government from 2010 to 2015, Secretary of State for Business, and before that was the Liberal Democrat Treasury spokesman during the financial crash. Many listeners may be aware of my view that we're still dealing with the repercussions of the crash of 2008, and so it's interesting to listen to Vince, who had a front row seat during that time, and in dealing with government spending from 2010. We also discuss foreign policy, including Ukraine, Russia, China, as well as Brexit. Links to their memoir are in the show notes, as well as a blog written by Vince on our website, perfect for those listeners from the Modern British Political History podcast. Coming up, I've got Elizabeth I with Stephen Virapen, The Dark Ages, and Tom Holland chats with me about history. Until then, I'll hand you over to Vince Cable and Rachel Smith talking with me about the coalition government. Vince Cable, Rachel Smith, welcome to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on, so thank you very much for joining me. And I wanted to kick off, really, because we're talking about your memoir, really, Rachel, it's your memoir, isn't it, with Vince as well? But we get your perspective quite strongly in this memoir, don't we?
Well, in the first half, there's a lot of Vince because he used press cuttings to remember and to get a perspective on what it looked like from outside. And then in the second half, when he wasn't in office, that he had a very vague memory of the sequence of events. And so my journal, which was very intermittent, located the text and the narrative a bit. And so we started doing it like the other way on. So my bit, and then he wrote his bit.
Right. And I was reading the blog that you've written for us, which when this goes out, our listeners can, I'll put a link in the show notes. And it's very interesting because when talking about political memoirs, you've written in the blog that there are some very good ones and there's some very boring ones. So what was that like to write? Were you, I guess the more spicier it becomes, the more interesting it is. But at the same time, you don't want to, I guess, betray confidences, and that can ruin relationships. I mean, how do you walk that rather fine line? Well, I'm assuming it's a fine line. It might not be.
Yes, I think it can be. We certainly didn't want to lose friends. It wasn't supposed to be a gossip column. It was supposed to be, in one way, a serious look at what it's like when your spouse is in high office. And I was very committed to the project. It wasn't that I was a reluctant trailing spouse, but you can't participate in bits of it. But you do want to be supportive.
And we haven't heard from Vince yet. Vince, the life of a politician, of an MP in Westminster, it's a lot of late nights. It's a lot of, I'm assuming it is, particularly if you're on the front bench or as a spokesperson for the Lib Dems and then in government. Home life must be just so weird and probably quite difficult for listeners to appreciate.
Yeah, it is very hard work. I mean, if you take the job seriously, of course, there are some MPs who don't and just take home the money and enjoy themselves in other ways. But if you take it seriously, and particularly if you get to senior level and ministerial level, there's a lot of pressure, and it's partly, of course, time and the fact that your time isn't your own, and you're having to organize your life around party whips and political events. But there's quite a lot of emotional pressure too. The public things when you find you're under attack, difficult relationships with colleagues or other people, which can be quite fraught. And as Rachel said, when we actually wrote this, one of the things we were quite careful about was our relationship with friends, the ones who were politically engaged with us. Because even quite friendly comments read about other people, can be interpreted in an unflattering way. So there were one or two cases where we actually asked our friends, "Is this your recollection of these events?" In some cases, we basically took a risk and commented about them in our own way and hoped they would carry it off. And one or two cases, we have ruffled feathers, and we've subsequently had to smooth the feathers down. So that side of it was a bit tricky. But going back to your basic question, the political life is difficult if you take it seriously. And I've been very lucky with Rachel. And indeed, I before Rachel, Olympia was my first wife. And she, kept me going through very difficult years when it was so easy to give up. I mean, there was a 30-year gap between my first standing for Parliament and getting in. And there were numerous times when you're inclined to just shrug your shoulders and say, to hell with it, let's go off and do something else. But, so you needed that kind of backing and support. And similarly, after 2001, when I got to know Rachel again, very difficult periods, particularly in the coalition times, and you desperately needed somebody to talk to go over the issues, to make sure that your perspective wasn't hopelessly distorted, which it is if you're in the middle of a cockpit, So both in the coalition times and at party leader times, Rachel was immensely supportive, partly in practical terms, but in emotional terms, being there to go over issues and talk about them to somebody you trust.
And Rachel, at home, does that mean you sort of effectively have to write Vince off? He's going to be in Parliament or his ministerial department, and so you just won't see him very much during the week.
Well, in the coalition period, I was still farming at the beginning, so I had a rather good excuse to be in the countryside, which is a place I like to be, and I've done it for many, many years, decades. So I was very involved with that, and I went on being involved with that. So it was good in a way that I was busy with my own stuff, and we both have children and grandchildren. So there's a hinterland of family stuff going on, but we didn't have immediate responsibility for anyone except ourselves. Because when you've got young family and you're in one household, you've got enormous pressures on you, which we actually didn't have in that way.
So I wanted to, Vince, I wanted to talk a little bit about, obviously, your more recent political career. I say recent, sort of starting around 2008, is probably when your name became quite prominent because of the financial crash. And I think not many politicians came out of the financial crash particularly well, but one could probably argue you did. And listeners to this podcast are familiar with, I've been ramming it down their throats that the 2008 crash is the disaster that has had many ramifications, and you can argue Trump and Brexit. And I wondered, looking back at it now, do you think we're still suffering from 2008?
Well, yes, we are. It added enormously to the stock of government debt, and we're still struggling with that problem. But it's affected us in a deeper way. I mean, going back to the basic premise of your question, you're absolutely right. I mean, I often created the metaphor of an economic heart attack. 2008-9, it had an enormously serious impact on the economy, partly because Britain was very exposed. We had some of the biggest banks in the world, and they collapsed. And it affected the economy in all kinds of ways, both in terms of the government budget and the accumulation of debt. It also had the effect of drying up credit. So certainly in the early years of the coalition, it was very difficult to get the banks to lend to particularly small, medium businesses. And so the traditional Keynesian approach to economic slowdown, recession just didn't work. But all the people I engage with on the political left don't seem to realize this. They seem to think the world started in 2010 and everything that's gone wrong since, including, the more painful aspects of austerity, was some kind of political choice that the coalition partners adopted out of some perverse wish to punish people who consume public services. It's complete nonsense. I mean, the alternatives we faced with were set out in what was called the Darling Plan, which was the Labour government's plan to deal with the big accumulation of debt and the big fiscal deficit that we walked into in 2010. And it involves spreading the pain over 7 years rather than 5. I mean, just to give an example, there's a lot of articles in the last few weeks because of the opening of the inquiry into the health effects of the pandemic, and very reputable people, Professor Marmot, amongst others, saying, one of the big problems of the pandemic was that austerity had such damaging effects on the health service. And if you extrapolate the spending from the great days of before 2010, much more should have been and would have been spent. Well, he simply, failed to take account of the fact that there was a big discontinuity. I mean, it just wasn't possible to continue as we had done in the past. The economy slowed down. There was a massive hit to productivity growth, which hasn't been recovered. And when we added to this legacy of government debt, which was then made worse by Brexit, then by the pandemic, then by the war, and those problems we're still living with. It is very much the hangover from the financial crisis. And just one final point is that, pursuing that metaphor about the heart attack. What happened was that you had to keep the patient alive, so all kind of pipes were stuck into the economy with adrenaline and so on, in the form of monetary easing, and that in turn has now created all these problems of inflation, that we injected this stimulus into the economy that wasn't withdrawn at the right time, actually because it wasn't easy to withdraw it, and it's had an inflationary long-term consequence.
Vince, so it's 2010, the election is inconclusive, coalition talks. Did you have a sort of preference before you went into the coalition as to which party, or were you really looking at what, I'm going to use the word demands, that's probably slightly too aggressive, but the requirements the Lib Dems had really depended which party would agree to them rather than a particular interest in a party?
The sequence of events was this, that in the 3 or 4 months in the run-up to the election, the Lib Dems had been, conducting a scenario planning exercise, if you like, some internal thinking about various outcomes and how we'd respond to them. Chris Huhne, I think, was leading that exercise with David Laws. So, we had some serious thinkers. It wasn't just back of the envelope stuff. There was proper analysis of both the legal and political ramifications. And we had certainly considered the possibility that we might find ourselves in a position where we'd have to work with the Conservatives. So it wasn't a completely shocking outcome. The fact is, temperamentally, I think most of us in the team, not all of us perhaps, would have preferred to work with the Labour people. And indeed, there was a political calculation. Most of us were in Conservative-facing parliamentary seats. So we had a self-interest in aligning ourselves with Labour against the Conservatives. But temperamentally, some of us felt more comfortable there. And in my case, I had a good relationship with Gordon Brown. I wouldn't say a close friend, but we'd had a lot of, discussions, got on well, I think looked at the world in a rather similar way. So I think in my case, I would have been more comfortable, but we had done the analysis and it was very clear when we got the numbers after the 2010 election that there was no viable alternative with Labour. We could have brought in the Scottish Nationalists and the Democratic Unionists, but such an arrangement would have been horrible and unstable, whereas a relationship with the Conservatives was at least stable, providing we could get an agreement on policy. I think what most of us in the team hadn't appreciated was that Nick Clegg had, I think, had quite detailed conversations with Cameron. I mean, entirely properly. I mean, party leaders should talk to each other, but had sort of teed up an arrangement with them that was already half formed when we got round to the coalition discussions.
And Rachel, how did the discussions affect you and Vince? Were you sort of, whatever happens, I'm behind you, or was it, for God's sake, not Labour or not Conservatives?
No, I accepted his economic argument about the need for coalition, but I found obviously the rest quite uncomfortable. But my role tended to be passing a phone over whenever it rang, rather than actually participating, because that wasn't needed, clearly. I found myself on the agricultural issues a bit of a protectionist, whereas Vince is a great free trader. And on certain other things, I would be more, I think, emotionally left-wing in some way. So I found the whole idea quite uncomfortable at the beginning, but accepted the argument, the intellectual argument, that we needed a stable government and we needed economic stability above all else.
And actually, this gets to another question I wanted to ask, which is that when Vince has made a decision that, I mean, do you have rows over political decisions, or is it more, I'm not entirely sure I was happy with that? Did you ever have an instance where Vince had done something in government that you really didn't approve of?
Well, not really. I mean, obviously the student fees was very difficult. And quite a lot of members of my family were shouting down in my other ear that this was appalling and mustn't happen. So that was undoubtedly tricky, very difficult. But then Vince was finding it very difficult already. He didn't need anyone else to tell him that this was a really difficult thing altogether. So no, and I suppose on the vote about intervening in Syria, we were on holiday in France. And the idea of going back to do this vote, and then Vince voted with the government for intervention, but in the meantime, that vote was lost. And so, curiously, he was trying to get back to where I was with a friend in La France Profonde. I mean, it wasn't near anything. And we knew before he did the outcome of the vote, because he was trying on several trains and so forth. So that was quite kind of funny in a way, that we were in the know before he was.
That's interesting, actually, because that vote on action in Syria was actually had quite large repercussions, because as a result of that, Obama didn't go in either.
Yes. It turned out it was a very significant vote, very significant decision, and whether things would have been better later in Syria if we had have done, golly, who knows? I mean, I'm a bit of a peacenik, so I don't think in general that armed conflict results in anything good.
Well, I was actually a bit of a hawk on this, indeed supported, although I had big disagreements with Tory colleagues on many issues, but on that I didn't.
Yeah. We're speaking as events are unfolding in Russia at the moment. And just on that, we have been talking conflict. So during the 2010-2015 period, the relationship between the government and the Russian government, Putin wasn't president then, although I guess was in all but name.
I think he was.
Period, wasn't he? I think, was it 2008, 2010?
Medvedev.
It was a bit Medvedev in the middle.
Yeah.
But it was very much the Putin era. Well, it was, I think, difficult to see back now, but back at that time, Russia was just seen as an opportunity, a big emerging market. I mean, one of the big roles I was given by Cameron was promoting British exports and foreign investment in these big emerging markets, which in particular were China, India, and Russia and Brazil. And I went to all of them several times. And in the case of Russia, it was a straightforward case of building up British trade with Russia. And I dealt with Putin's economic ministers. That wasn't seen as being a big problem in the relationship. the British Embassy, when I was there, sort of introduced me to some dissidents, which suggested that life in Russia wasn't quite as good as it appeared. But, as a government, we dealt with the government in Russia without a problem, with some of the oligarchs who I, shook hands with and got to know a little bit. And of course, relations deteriorated very badly after the 2014 invasion. So our attempts to build up relationships with Russia stopped at that point. We got into sanctions, but before that, it was positive. The biggest change, of course, was China. I mean, I was heavily involved in promoting the so-called golden era, a lot of trade investment, good relationship with Huawei. I had several visits to China, one of which Rachel came along with. And I still believe that actually there's more opportunity than threat in our relations with China, and have written to that effect, to the annoyance of some former colleagues. But putting it in context, the earlier part of the last decade was Britain trying to recover from the collapse of the banking system and the economy, building up emerging market exports, and Russia and China was seen in very positive terms, and I was part of that process.
The 2014 invasion of the Donbass and Crimea, do you think that the government responded strongly enough?
Well, given my role in BIS, I tended to argue against some of the sanctions. There was one particularly celebrated case where a British company, Subsea 7, which is a very high-tech Scottish company in Aberdeen, was exporting equipment which rescued submariners from submarines. And you know the story of the Kursk, and indeed the story last week. And I thought it was a perfectly sensible, good export order, the kind of thing we should be engaging in. But then I ran up against strong opposition from the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Office, who said we shouldn't be exporting anything like that to Russia. It's not our job to save Russian submariners in a war situation. So we had, quite a punch-up over that. And I was arguing for more trade rather than less trade.
And you've mentioned China and Huawei. You don't think there's any risk, because it is owned by the Chinese government, isn't it?
Well, Huawei is a private company, a very successful private company. And when I was in the government, I was naturally anxious not to get the wrong side of the security services. So I repeatedly asked their advice. I said, is there a problem here? In fact, Huawei were embedded with things like GCHQ. It wasn't just that they were an ordinary telecoms company. And I was always told there is absolutely no problem. It's very good for the UK to have access to this world-class technology. It was better than any other company in the world. And if they do misbehave, we have protocols to stop it happening. And so it's nothing for you to worry about. And actually, the same advice was given later to Theresa May. So it wasn't just me. But the Americans effectively said, no can do. You should not deal with Huawei for their own strategic and economic reasons. The nuclear thing was a bit more difficult, but the ministers involved, that was myself, Ed Davey, Letwin, who were involved in the negotiations around the Hinkley Point, were actually welcomed the fact that the Chinese were willing to put in an investment, and the quid pro quo was that they could then invest in a new reactor in Bradwell as part of the nuclear power establishment, which they would then use as a kind of prototype to demonstrate Chinese technology, which is actually first class and very safe in this area, and help them build up their exports. And there's a very clear commercial interest from the Chinese point of view, but there was no security risk, though. People get emotional about this, and they say, well, nuclear power, James Bond, Goldfinger is going to press some button and blow it up. I mean, that was complete nonsense. It was, we'd just been scared off it because of this new Cold War.
Well, now we're in this energy problem at the moment. I was reading, I think back in 2010, or certainly the early days of the coalition, I did read recently a quote from Nick Clegg, who stated that nuclear power stations took too long to build. which is one of the reasons why there wasn't so much investment in them. Had they obviously began thinking about construction, we'd be close to having those power stations coming online now, which would be quite handy, wouldn't it? What was your view on nuclear power as a whole for an energy solution which is pretty green in the United Kingdom?
Well, the Lib Dems had traditionally been opposed to nuclear power as one of the policies that had come up through our conference. But it was very clear when we were in government that if we were serious about reducing carbon emissions, this was an obvious source, and it also provided a source of energy security because it was a diversity. It wasn't climate, it wasn't seasonal fluctuation as you get with wind. So it was something we had to do. Of course, it was expensive. The cost of a unit of power is higher than it is from wind and gas, and it's also long gestation times, but we took the plunge. I think it was the right thing to do. And at the moment, the biggest hole in Europe is in Somerset, where this enormous project is now taking shape, and it will be delivering power in a couple of years.
So when we get to 2015 and it's complete wipeout for the Lib Dems, what were you both going through? I'll start with Vince, really. What was going through your mind when you were seeing the results coming in? And you had a healthy majority yourself in Twickenham.
Yes, I think that we knew there was going to be, we were going to lose a lot of seats, but we'd done quite a lot of polling, which suggested that the Lib Dems could probably hold on to 30, including mine. And we coasted through the earlier part of the 2015 election, believing that that was the case. And certainly my early canvassing in Twickenham was very positive, and I was encouraged to go around the country supporting more vulnerable colleagues, which I did. And then the Tories hit us with this devastatingly effective and very sophisticated propaganda campaign, which basically said, if you've got a Lib Dem MP, they're probably very good and you like them. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. But if you vote for them, you're going to finish up with Red Ed Miliband and the Scottish Nationalists in government, which of course is complete nonsense, but it frightened a lot of voters. What happened was that, of course, that it wasn't a vote against the coalition because the Tory vote went up. It was a vote against us, largely on tactical reasons, though, of course, we'd also alienated some of our Labour tactical voters by going in with the Tories, tuition fees, all that kind of stuff.
And Rachel, what was going through your mind that night? Was it sort of, thank God it's all over, we can relax now, get for a bit of time?
There certainly was a little bit of that, although that night was particularly awful. And so we were advised, and we did, rush back to the countryside, but B, join Vince up to the local gym on day one, which proved to be a very good tactic. But without the countryside to escape to, I think it would have been even more difficult to sit in Twickenham with everybody being extremely sympathetic, at least all, of course, all our mates being extremely sympathetic. And it just was emotionally extremely difficult for Vince, which I found understandable. I mean, I've only ever stood at that very local level for elections, and losing them is difficult even at that level. You feel personally rejected, however much it wasn't your fault. And it was very, very hard on him.
Vince, I don't want to force you to go through this traumatic night again, but the rejection by the voters, is it quite brutal in that, you're almost immediately, your pass is rescinded and you have to clear out your office pretty quick, just like the Prime Minister when that changes?
Yes, it is. I mean, what was happening in Twickenham was I was bumping into lots of people who said, "Oh, we're so sorry you lost. We would have voted for you if you thought you were in trouble, but we thought you were nice and safe, so we decided we could vote for somebody else." And some of that was sincere and some of it wasn't. But anyway, since I got back 2 years later with an enormous majority, it was fairly clear that quite a lot of voters had got regrets for what they did. But in terms of dealing with it personally, I mean, that it was at that point that Rachel was a phenomenal source of support, emotional support, and also my children who were helpful too. But what happened is we went away to the country the following day. It was a nice sunny day. We thought about the future and all the things that we could now do, that we were liberated from the grind of parliamentary schedule. And I think because we're both fairly positive people and practical people and not inclined to depression, we actually came away thinking, well, this is an opportunity and not just an awful experience. We're going to make the best of it. And actually we did.
When it comes to clearing out the office, when you're a minister, you have to clear out your office before the election. So there was this huge clear out from 1 Victoria Street that went on before the election. And that got quite comic because we had some personal things, some ceramics and a picture or two and so on that were ours, that were in his office. And we had an expedition to go and get them. Forgetting about the congestion charge, because we never drive into London, we go on public transport. And B, others helping us in the basement to get these things into a car. And we had a sort of procession of his staff holding things. It looked like a sort of raid, an actual burglary. It was really very funny. So there are some funny moments in government.
And as Vince just said, it's Phoenix from the Flame stuff, re-elected in 2017 with a massive majority. But were you thinking, really, do we have to go through all this again?
There was a little bit of that. Yeah, here we go again. Yes, there was for me. But nonetheless, I mean, from Vince's point of view, he was vindicated in that he got back with a huge majority. And of course, the party needed him more than ever because the numbers were so small.
Nick Clegg had lost his seat, hadn't he, in 2017?
Yes. No, it was a very small band of Lib Dem MPs in Parliament at that point.
So did that make party management quite easy, Vince?
It did at the beginning, not at the end. No, it's. I think as part of a cyclical process when you're a party leader, there's an enormous amount of goodwill at the beginning, and then people get impatient. They somehow assume that if you make a couple of speeches, the party's public opinion poll will double, and you're on the way to winning the next election. If it doesn't happen, somehow you've been negligent and haven't been trying. There's a bit of that. And I experienced that full cycle. But certainly at the beginning, it would have been better in a way if Ed Davey or Joe Swinson had decided to compete with me. But they didn't, for good personal reasons. So I got in by default as the party leader. So although I went around the country meeting all the local activists, it wasn't in that competitive spirit that really engaged them. And so it was a slightly weak start, and not my fault, but you didn't have the benefit of an electoral mandate within the party. But I think initially it went well, and I committed the party to the People's Vote campaign, a fairly aggressive approach to Brexit, which the activists liked. We had an enormous surge in membership, which partly I'd inherited from Tim Farron, but it kept growing. We were seen as the anti-Brexit party. We had, I think, the membership was well over 100,000, which is about 3 times what it was in the heyday of Charles Kennedy. So, there were some good things happening, but then it became very scratchy and frustrating. We didn't have any by-elections. The only thing I could point to were good local government election results. We were winning quite a lot of local by-elections. 2018 result was good, but not brilliant. It was only in 2019 that we got the real breakthrough in local government with really very big gains, biggest in our history, I think, and then followed up by the European campaign. But by then I'd already decided to, pass on to the next generation.
So you mentioned the people's vote there. I voted Remain, and a passionate EU Remainer, I suppose. But I always assumed, I thought the people's vote idea was a bit risky. It seemed to me that it would almost certainly result in defeat. But obviously you don't think that because you were a prominent supporter of having a second vote. Are you confident that would have been won? Because I don't think it would have been.
Well, it was touch and go, I think. Now, my views were a bit more nuanced than perhaps it came across to the public. Initially, after the referendum, I thought we should accept the result and work for a kind of soft Brexit with keeping the single market and the customs union and the economic side. Tim Farron was much more gung-ho on, returning to the European Union. But once I'd become party leader, and once Theresa May had made this commitment to leave the economic structures of the economic union, she didn't have to. I mean, it wasn't mandated in the referendum, but once she decided to tear up the core bit of our membership, I thought we would then justified in going for a hard line opposition, and trying to get a referendum on the outcome of the negotiations. As the climax approached, it was fairly clear in Parliament that we were about 10, 20 votes short, that with the Lib Dems, the SNP, Labour defectors, and a few courageous Tories, we could muster a big vote, but it was still a little bit short. And the big question then was, should we dilute our policy and settle for just staying in a customs union, which was the Ken Clarke compromise, or should we remain uncompromising and the party of principle Europe and so on? And there was a very strong feeling amongst my colleagues that we had to stay firm with the hard line. People like Norman Lamb made a very good case for a compromise, but that going for the compromise solution, but that wasn't the mood in the party at all.
And Rachel, the Brexit wars, I think everyone looks back on them probably quite glad they're over, because it was a pretty horrible time. What was it like to be the spouse of an MP during that, I guess, 2017 to 2019?
We did an awful lot of marching. And so in terms of energy, it was very tiring indeed. But in terms of spirit of the party and stuff, it was wonderful. And we felt it was a very important battle. And I, to this day, just think it was a wrong direction. It just upset me. I mean, I've come from a family where my ex-husband's half Dutch and my first child was born in Holland. And we did a lot of traveling in France in particular. And I did feel myself to be European. And lots of my family do. And Vince has a Slovakian daughter-in-law, and she was deeply upset. So it was quite emotional, but also very exhilarating in one way. But it was sad that we lost that vote in the end. We lost the argument, I suppose. But I think now there are an awful lot of regretful leavers who think they did get it wrong.
Yes, Vince. What do you think the future holds regarding Britain's relationship with Europe? As Rachel says, there seems to be a majority now. It's difficult to know whether it's rejoin or would have voted remain. It depends on the polls you look.
I think rejoin it. I don't think they want us. Sorry.
That's obviously we're not very good.
I think rejoin is for the distant future, really. Sorry, Vince.
Going back a little bit, I think we need to reflect a bit on why the 2019 election turned out so badly. And part of it was revoking the referendum. I mean, there was no way people were going to buy that, given that we'd had 3 or 4 years of pressing for a second or another referendum, to say, oh, forget it, we're just going to cancel the whole thing. I know that wasn't how Joe argued it, but that was how it came across, and it was really disastrous for the party and for the Remain campaign, actually. And added to the fact that people were, a lot of soft Tories, as we call them, were absolutely scared stiff of Corbyn. The election was lost, Boris got Brexit done, but that was the background to it. But in terms of where we go from here, there isn't much scope for changing the dynamics fundamentally in the short run, partly, as Rachel just said, the Europeans wouldn't have us back, having caused so much disruption. It would probably be on inferior terms. And there is still a very, very hard pro-Brexit group. Some people have changed their minds, many haven't. So it would be very divisive again. And it's not at all clear that when the conditions were set out that people would vote to go back in. I think a better approach is to think over a 5 to 10 year period, to work through a series of steps to rejoin European institutions, the research bodies, the customs union, the single market, each of which is quite a difficult step. And if at the end of that, decades time, people feel, well, actually, we really ought to be formally part of the European Union, whatever it then is, then let's do it. But it's got to be a kind of cautious step-by-step approach, I think.
So it sounds like a 20-odd year project.
Probably, or 15, certainly at the least, yeah.
Interesting. Now, you've mentioned Corbyn and 2019, and you originally joined the Labour Party and stood as a candidate and then moved to the SDP. Is that right, in the early 80s?
Yes, I was part of the breakaway Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams group. I mean, actually, unlike some of them, and I was reasonably comfortable in the Labour Party, mostly I'd worked for John Smith as his special advisor. There were a lot of mainstream Labour people I got on very well with and felt at home with, but I lived in a part of London, suburban London, where the Labour Party was completely mad. I mean, if you remember those days, it was bad enough in places like Hampstead and further north in Haringey, where Corbyn came from. But the Labour parties around the countries were absolutely in the kind of lunatic fringe of the militant tendency. And just going to one of the meetings was so utterly infuriating and dispiriting that a lot of us who were then mainstream Labour just felt we couldn't take any more of it and left and joined the SDP. And of course, we thought the Labour Party would then break. Well, it didn't, thanks to Tony Blair. But the virus of extreme revolutionary leftism, remained in dormant state and then reappeared in the form of Jeremy Corbyn. So in a sense, history was relived in the last few years.
Do you think that, I guess, that dormant strain will be in the Labour Party forever?
Not necessarily. Starmer's done a very good job, actually, in basically very ruthless in sort of cutting it out of the party. But I think what could well happen is we get a period of Labour government. We may or may not be part of it, but a period of Labour government, people will get disillusioned because there's not a great deal they can do given the economic position of the country. And disillusionment will take various forms. I mean, one of it may be, swing back to the nationalistic new Tory party, kind of UKIP reborn. And some of it will take the form of hard left politics. They've got some allies in the Green Party, and of course, all those people who belonged to Momentum, they're still there. I mean, they've been either thrown out or left the Labour Party. They're still around, and they will form a new movement on the far left. So I think the next few years could be quite uncomfortable in British politics, both on the left and the right.
But then it sounds like that's an opportunity for a centrist party like the Liberal Democrats.
It is, providing we have a change in the voting system. I mean, I don't want to rehearse all the arguments which you know very, very well, but as long as we're competing with, moderate Labour and the Starmer moderate Tories, of whom there's still a few left, we're in a very crowded space and we're the third party and we've got all the problems to overcome in first past the posts. But if it does happen that we get a change in the voting system, there will be more opportunity to get MPs elected. Anything is then possible.
Rachel, so this book, we're running out of time, and I know you're both very busy. But Rachel, this was This book was written during lockdown, is that right? I mean, a lot of people were being very productive during lockdown.
It was put together during lockdown. My bit, of course, came from my journals, which were already long since written, without which I wouldn't have done it and couldn't have done it. But for Vince, yes, he got into it during lockdown, and we were in the countryside for nearly a year, 90% of the time. So yes, we worked quite solidly at it at that point.
I think one of the motives, I mean, because we had so much time and opportunities to reflect, I was getting more and more agitated about the way the Lib Dems had been written out of history. You know, we had done something quite brave. We'd achieved a great deal in the coalition years. It was either ignored or attributed to the Conservatives. We'd stopped a lot of bad things happening, but nobody was saying that. And I felt, you know, I did need to put the history on the record as somebody who was at the middle of it all. But I couldn't, because I only had a kind of partial memory of what had happened. And then we discovered, I didn't realize this, but Rachel had actually kept very good diaries of most parts.
You didn't know?
Well, I knew she was busily scribbling away in a little exercise book. But
they weren't secret. They were not secret diaries.
But I hadn't realized quite how good they were, actually.
Ah.
And a lot of it was personal, and that some of it was reflections on the time. And we realized if we put the two together, we had something serious to say. And we haven't yet had a big readership, but all the people who've read it think that it's original and interesting and adds to the history of the time.
Well, that's a great way to end it, Vince. A history of the time. Thanks very much. I'll put a link in the show notes for listeners to go to for that. And it just leaves me to say, Vince and Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. An interesting chat on life in government. Plenty more great history coming up, including Elizabeth I, the Dark Ages and Tom Holland. So do please subscribe and join me for those. In the meantime, thank you and good night.